So we have seen in our conversation of everything that has occurred up until this point in our inquiry into the good, in the history of the conversation about this in the West, that it really has come down to two basic points of view. What we might call naturalism versus supernaturalism. Is meaning a product of the system as a whole, or is there something outside of the cosmos, something otherworldly, which gives the cosmos its meaning and its goal, its intentionality? In other words, is the universe like a machine that gets its purpose from its design, or is the universe and everything in the universe simply the product of non-intentional forces? And all intention within it is something that arises out of that non-intentionality. So really the debate as it's come to us today is the debate between naturalism versus supernaturalism. And the question of miracles crystallizes that. Because what do we mean by miracle? Well, we mean just an interference in nature that somehow manipulates the laws in a way that nature wouldn't do on her own. And so, thus, we're going to define miracle, Lewis says, as a sign of intelligent interference with nature. But the key here is, what is nature? What is naturalism? And what is supernaturalism? And this is important because if nature is all that there is, then it follows that there can't be an outside, and thus there can't be any manipulation from the outside because nature is all there is. And so the question of meaning, of signs, really comes to the question of, is naturalism true? Is nature all that there is? So we're going to spend this particular segment distinguishing between the naturalist worldview and the supernaturalist worldview and getting more clear what the difference is, because if naturalism is true, then no matter what happens in nature, it can always be explained in the long run, even if not by us, as a natural event and therefore not a miracle. And therefore we see that the real crucial question of existence of God and miracles is really the question that Nietzsche and Schopenhauer have left us. And that is nature all that there is? Is Carl Sagan right that the cosmos is all that there is, ever will be, and ever was? So how are we going to explain naturalism? Well, Lewis notes something here. That the problem is that supernaturalists and the naturalists, when they use the word nature, they mean two different things by it. All that the naturalist means by nature is everything. The problem is the supernaturalist believes everything exists too, and that God is one of them, or the gods are a few of them, and that they're somehow outside of nature. And so thus the word nature is being bandied around in two different ways. So let's approach it from a different way. Let's ask this question. When you look at your own existence and you ask where you come from, or you look at a rock and you ask where does that come from, and why is it there? Why is there something rather than nothing, as the question goes in philosophy? The naturalist states this. The naturalist is stating that the most basic facts of existence that explain everything else are things that are non-intentional, non-personal, that there is no intelligence behind the origin of everything, and that in fact everything is part of this single interlocking system that we call nature, and that this interlocking system's principles are just like laws that govern everything, and that ultimately everything can be explained as a product of the initial conditions within that system and the general operating principles of that system. And that these general operating principles are not mechanical principles. They're just principles of cause and effect. So, for example, if you and I were to get into a spaceship and go to Mars, and we were to search for intelligent life on Mars, what would we be looking for? We'd be looking for evidence of manipulation. In other words, we'd be trying to distinguish between things that are natural, that could have occurred naturally, versus things that nature couldn't have produced on her own. So Lewis notes that in all the uses of the word nature, natural versus non-natural, the crucial element in all of them is so on its own, not a product of intention. So thus, the two crucial elements of naturalism is this. There are no separately existing facts. Every fact is part of this big interconnected fact. And this big interconnected fact, which we call nature, is so of its own and explains its general operating principles. Its laws explain everything that go on within this interconnected fact, so that every fact within the big fact is explained by what occurred before it in that big fact. Nature is just this big system and process, impersonal process of becoming. And everything that becomes is a product of that big process and can be explained by that process on its own without needing to be bringing in things like intention or design from the outside. So, does this mean that consciousness doesn't exist? No. Does this mean that gods can't exist? No, indeed. Paganism in its classic form, Roman and Greek paganism, is a form of naturalism. If you look at all of the cosmogonies, the most famous is Hesiod's and Homer's, you will see that the gods are not the creators of the universe at large, nature, but are themselves the product of the union of Uranus and Gaia, heaven and earth. The gods themselves have ancestors, and they have ancestors. And so therefore the gods themselves, even though they're very powerful beings, they themselves are ultimately the product of an impersonal system called nature. So you can have gods, you can have consciousness, you can even believe that the universe itself develops consciousness. Carl Sagan is very famous for saying that the universe developed us so that it could know itself. And so thus, the naturalist isn't against the idea of minds or consciousness. It is just saying that all of those are not ultimate. They're not the things that exist in themselves. They are ultimately the product of this self-existing fact called nature, and can be explained by the non-personal, non-intentional principles that go into this system. And thus science, by studying nature, studies everything. Now, if this is true, then there's no outside, right? And therefore there's no interference. Any event that occurs will therefore be occurring in nature because of nature and can be ultimately explained by these ultimate laws of nature and the conditions that occurred before that event. So thus, if the naturalism is true, there can be no miracles, and therefore there can be no signs of an outside. You might say it like this: nature has no windows. But supernaturalism, therefore, once we understand naturalism, is the denial of that. It's saying there's at least one other thing, perhaps more, that exists on its own, apart from nature. It might relate with nature, but it might even interfere with nature. But it is not a product of nature. It is not a product of these impersonal laws and forces of nature, and therefore is supernatural, beyond nature. Now, what that is, it depends on your view, right? Theism, classical theism of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam is supernaturalism because it claims that the whole system of things that we find ourselves in, the cosmos, is not the only thing, but it is a product of the forces and design of something that exists on its own that is the creator of nature. So you see how that's supernaturalism. But it could come in the form of multiple gods existing outside of nature. So in order to decide the question of meaning, and whether there is an intentional design behind nature, we have to decide the question of, is naturalism true? What Lewis will go on and argue is that the naturalist actually has this huge problem. A problem that naturalism itself, if it can be proven to be true, actually proves itself false. It is self-defeating. And therefore, that since it's self-defeating, it contains within itself a contradiction that proves its very falseness, even when we try to espouse it, even when we try to hold on to it as the ultimate truth about being in general. So in our next segment, Lewis is going to argue not only is supernaturalism something that could be true, and therefore miracles, nature is not immune from miracles. Indeed, naturalism cannot be true because it defeats itself. The minute we think we know it, we find there can be no knowledge at all. We'll explain that in much more detail in several segments.